The summer of 1987 arrived in northern Wisconsin, with the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the asphalt and turned the forests into thick, breathing labyrinths of green. It was the kind of summer that children remembered forever. The taste of melting popsicles, the sting of lake water in their noses, the freedom that came with being far from home. For 12-year-old twins Emily and Rebecca Hartwell, that summer promised adventure. Their parents had enrolled them in Camp Stillwater, a sleepaway camp nestled deep in the woods of Vilas County, where the nearest town was 15 miles away and the nearest hospital even farther. Camp Stillwater had operated since 1952, a relic of post-war optimism when parents believed fresh air and structured activities could build character in their children. By 1987, it had become a modest operation, hosting around 60 campers each session in weathered cabins that surrounded a murky lake. The camp director, Thomas Brennan, was a former school teacher in his late 50s, who ran the place with his wife Dorothy. They employed a small staff of college-aged counselors, most of whom returned year after year, drawn by nostalgia or the promise of an easy summer job away from the world. Emily and Rebecca were identical twins, though anyone who knew them could tell them apart instantly. Emily wore her blonde hair in a practical ponytail and approached everything with careful consideration. Rebecca kept her hair loose and wild, and she moved through life as if it were a game she intended to win. Their parents, Michael and Patricia Hartwell, had debated whether to send them to camp at all. The girls had never been separated from home for more than a night or two, but the twins had begged, enchanted by the glossy brochure that promised campfires, canoeing, and archery lessons. Michael worked long hours as an accountant, and Patricia had recently returned to teaching. The camp would give the girls a memorable summer, they reasoned, and give the parents time to breathe. The Hartwells drove their daughters north on June 21st, the longest day of the year. They arrived at Camp Stillwater in the late afternoon, when the sun hung low and golden through the pines. Other parents were unloading duffel bags and sleeping bags, their children already running toward the lake with the manic energy of freedom. Emily and Rebecca stood close to their mother, suddenly hesitant now that the moment had arrived. Patricia knelt and pulled them both into an embrace, breathing in the smell of their strawberry shampoo one last time. "You'll have a wonderful time," she told them, "and if you don't, you can call us any time. We'll come get you." Michael shook hands with Thomas Brennan, who assured him the girls would be well looked after. The counselors seemed responsible enough, young women in their early 20s with sun-bleached hair and easy smiles. The twins were assigned to Cabin 7, which housed 8 girls total, all around the same age. Their counselor was a 22-year-old named Jennifer Walsh, a biology student from Madison who had worked at the camp for 3 summers. The Hartwells left as the sun began to set, their station wagon disappearing down the dirt road in a cloud of dust. Emily watched until she couldn't see it anymore, then turned to find Rebecca already making friends with the other girls in their cabin. The first week passed without incident. The twins wrote home on the camp's pre-stamped postcards, their messages cheerful and brief. Emily described a successful attempt at making a lanyard in arts and crafts. Rebecca wrote about winning a swimming race across the lake. Neither mentioned being homesick. In their cabin at night, the girls whispered and giggled until Jennifer told them to settle down. The woods outside their windows rustled with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, and the lake lapped gently against the rocky shore. But Camp Stillwater was not quite the idyllic refuge it appeared to be. The camp sat on land that had a troubled history, though few people spoke of it openly. In 1969, a 16-year-old counselor named David Kemper had drowned in the lake during a midnight swim. The official report called it an accident. He had been drinking, the water was cold. He had suffered a cramp and gone under before anyone could reach him. But some of the longtime staff whispered that David had seemed troubled in the days before his death, that he'd talked about hearing voices in the woods at night, about feeling watched. After his death, the camp had closed for 2 summers before reopening under new management. Then there was the matter of the old ranger station. Half a mile north of the camp, accessible only by an overgrown trail, stood the ruins of a fire lookout tower, and the ranger's cabin that had serviced it. The tower had been decommissioned in the early 1960s when aerial surveillance made ground-based lookouts obsolete. The cabin had been abandoned even longer. Officially, the area was off-limits to campers, though every summer a few brave souls would sneak out to explore it, daring each other to venture inside the decaying structure. Jennifer Walsh knew about the ranger station. She had been there herself as a teenage camper, drunk on cheap beer and teenage invincibility. But she also knew that Thomas Brennan took the rules serious. Any camper caught wandering off camp property faced immediate dismissal and a call home to their parents. So when she conducted head counts each night before lights out, she made sure every girl in cabin 7 was accounted for. On the evening of July 3rd, the night before Independence Day, the camp held a special event. The counselors organized a treasure hunt through the woods, dividing the campers into teams of 4. Each team received a map with cryptic clues leading to various stations where small prizes waited: bags of candy, cheap plastic toys, glow sticks. The hunt would culminate in a bonfire by the lake, where they would roast marshmallows and Thomas Brennan would lead them in patriotic songs. Emily and Rebecca were placed on different teams, which irritated them both. Rebecca was paired with 3 girls from cabin 5, none on whom she knew well. Emily ended up with 2 girls from her own cabin and a quiet boy named Peter from cabin 2. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the pines, the teams scattered into the woods, armed with flashlights and their maps. Rebecca's team moved quickly, almost recklessly. The other girls, Ashley, Megan, and Danielle, seemed determined to win, and Rebecca fed off their competitive energy. They found the first 3 stations easily, one by the archery range, one near the boathouse, one at the edge of the clearing where the volleyball net sagged between 2 poles. At each station they grabbed their prize and checked their map for the next clue. The 4th station proved more difficult to locate. The clue referenced the old guardian's shadow, which none of them understood. They wandered in circles, their flashlight beams cutting through the deepening darkness, arguing about what the clue might mean. Finally, Danielle suggested it might refer to the ranger station. Wasn't a ranger a kind of guardian? The girls knew they shouldn't go that far. The ranger station was explicitly off-limits, but the competition burned in their blood, and the night felt magical, charged with possibility. If they could find the station and retrieve the prize, they would almost certainly win. Rebecca led the way. She had a natural sense of direction and moved through the woods with confidence, pushing through underbrush and ducking beneath low branches. The other girls followed, less certain but unwilling to be left behind. They walked for what felt like a long time, though in reality it was probably only 15 minutes. The sounds of the camp faded behind them, the distant shouts of other teams, the crackling of the bonfire being prepared. Then, through the trees, they saw it, the ranger station, or what remained of it. The fire tower loomed above them, a skeletal structure of wood and metal that creaked in the wind. The cabin at its base was small and dark, its windows empty sockets, its door hanging open on rusted hinges. The girls approached slowly, their earlier bravado evaporating. The clearing around the station was overgrown with weeds and wildflowers that looked ghostly in the beam of their flashlights. An old sign, barely legible, warned visitors to stay out. Danielle whispered that maybe they should go back, but Rebecca had already spotted something, a small red flag tied to a branch near the cabin entrance. The same kind of flag that marked all the treasure hunt stations. "There," she said, pointing. They really did put one here. The girls exchanged glances. They had come this far. It seemed foolish to turn back now. Rebecca walked to the cabin door and peered inside. The interior was pitch black, but her flashlight revealed a small wooden table and an overturned chair. Spider webs stretched across the corners. The air smelled of rot and damp earth. On the table sat a small paper bag, the prize they had been seeking. She stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under her weight. The other girls waited at the threshold, too frightened to follow. Rebecca crossed to the table in 3 quick strides, grabbed the bag, and turned to leave. That's when they heard it, a sound from somewhere above them, from within the fire tower itself. A long, low creak, as if something very heavy was moving across the wooden platform at the top. All 4 girls ran. They crashed back through the woods, branches whipping at their faces, their flashlights swinging wildly. They didn't stop until they burst into the clearing where the bonfire was being lit, their chests heaving, their faces flushed. Jennifer Walsh rushed over, her expression shifting from concern to anger. "Where were you? You're 20 minutes late, and you were supposed to stay within the boundary markers." "We went to the ranger station," Ashley blurted out, and Jennifer's face went pale. She pulled the girls aside, away from the others, and questioned them sharply. Had they gone inside? Had they seen anyone? Were they hurt? Rebecca showed her the paper bag they'd retrieved, which contained nothing but some stale candy and a plastic whistle. Jennifer's jaw tightened. "You're never, ever supposed to go there," she said, her voice shaking. "Do you understand? That place is dangerous. The structure is unstable," and she stopped herself, as if she'd been about to say something else. The incident was reported to Thomas Brennan, who called the girls to his office one by one and delivered stern lectures about following rules and respecting boundaries. Their parents were not called. Brennan preferred to handle discipline internally, but the girls were banned from the next day's Independence Day canoe trip as punishment. Emily heard about her sister's misadventure when the campers returned to their cabins that night. She was annoyed that Rebecca had taken such a stupid risk, but also a little envious of the excitement. Nothing interesting ever happened on Emily's team. They had come in last place in the treasure hunt, and the other kids had been sullen and boring. That night, as the girls in Cabin 7 settled into their sleeping bags, Rebecca lay awake longer than usual. She kept thinking about the ranger station, about that sound they'd heard from the tower. It had probably been just the wind, or maybe an animal, an owl or a raccoon, but it hadn't sounded like wind. It had sounded deliberate, like footsteps. She rolled over and whispered to Emily, whose bunk was next to hers. "Do you think it's really dangerous?" "The ranger station?" Emily didn't answer. She was already asleep, her breathing slow and even. Rebecca closed her eyes and tried to do the same. Outside, the Wisconsin woods hummed with the sounds of summer night crickets chirping, frogs calling from the lake, the distant hoot of an owl. Somewhere in the darkness, something else moved through the trees, but no one at Camp Stillwater heard it. The next morning, July 4th, dawned hot and humid. The sky was a hard blue, cloudless and bright. The campers who weren't banned from the canoe trip prepared their boats at the lake's edge, slathering themselves with sunscreen and adjusting their life jackets. Emily would be going. Rebecca would not. The punishment stung, but Rebecca tried not to show it. She and the 3 other rule breakers would spend the day doing menial tasks around the camp, cleaning the mess hall, organizing the supply shed, pulling weeds from the garden. Emily felt guilty leaving her sister behind, but the pull of the lake was too strong. She climbed into a canoe with Peter, the quiet boy from her treasure hunt team, and they paddled out into the water. The lake stretched before them, vast and dark and cool. Beneath the surface, unseen currents moved like muscles under skin. Rebecca spent the morning scrubbing tables in the mess hall, her resentment growing with each passing hour. By lunchtime, the canoe trip group had returned, sun-tired and happy, and Rebecca had to endure Emily's cheerful recounting of their adventure. They had paddled all the way to the far shore, where the counselors had led them on a short hike to a waterfall. It had been beautiful, Emily said. Rebecca should have been there. That afternoon, the camp organized a softball game and a pie-eating contest. The sun blazed down, relentless. Dorothy Brennan brought out an industrial fan for the mess hall, but it only pushed the hot air round in lazy circles. Some of the younger campers grew cranky with the heat, and one boy threw up after eating too much watermelon. Dinner was hamburgers and potato salad, served at picnic tables under the pines. As evening approached, the counselors began setting up for the fireworks display. Thomas Brennan had purchased a modest assortment of sparklers and small rockets, which he would light at dusk over the lake. The campers gathered on the beach, swatting at mosquitoes and waiting for the sun to set. Emily and Rebecca sat together, their earlier tension forgotten. They wrote their names in the air with sparklers, the bright trails hanging for a moment before fading. The first stars appeared overhead, faint against the darkening blue. From across the lake, a loon called, its cry haunting and strange. The fireworks began just after 9 o'clock. They were nothing spectacular, a few bursts of red and white, some crackling fountains of gold. But the campers cheered anyway, their faces turned upward, the colors reflecting in their wide eyes. The show lasted perhaps 10 minutes, and then it was over. Thomas Brennan announced that everyone should head back to their cabins for the night. It had been a long day, and tomorrow would come early. The girls of Cabin 7 trudged back through the dark, their flashlights bobbing. Jennifer Walsh did a head count as they entered, 8 girls, all accounted for. She reminded them to brush their teeth and change into their pajamas. The night was still oppressively hot, and she propped the cabin door open to let in whatever breeze might find them. Emily and Rebecca changed into their sleep clothes and climbed into their bunks. The other girls chattered quietly, too wired from the day's excitement to sleep. Jennifer shushed them once, then twice, then finally threatened to make them all run laps around the cabin if they didn't settle down. Gradually, the whispers faded. The sounds of deep breathing filled the cabin. Outside, the woods creaked and rustled with nocturnal life. Jennifer Walsh lay awake in her counselor's bunk near the door, reading by flashlight. She was halfway through a Stephen King novel, Misery, which had been published that June. The story was disturbing, but she couldn't put it down. She read until her eyes grew heavy, then marked her place and switched off the flashlight. She woke sometime later to darkness and silence. The cabin was still, save for the soft sounds of sleeping children. She checked her watch. It was just past 3 in the morning. Something had woken her, though she couldn't say what. Perhaps she had been dreaming. She lay still, listening. The night seemed different somehow, heavier. The air felt charged, the way it did before a thunderstorm, though the sky had been clear earlier. Then she heard it, a faint creaking sound from outside, like the groan of old wood under weight. She sat up slowly, her heart beginning to pound. The cabin door was still propped open, exactly as she'd left it. Through the opening, she could see a slice of the clearing beyond, illuminated by pale moonlight. A shadow moved across the doorway. Just a flicker, there and gone. Jennifer grabbed her flashlight and crossed to the door, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She stepped outside onto the small porch and swept her beam across the clearing. Nothing. Just trees and shadows and the faint shimmer of the lake in the distance. She was being paranoid, she told herself. The woods were full of animals. It was probably just a deer. She went back inside, pulled the door almost closed, and returned to her bunk. But she didn't sleep. She lay awake until the sky began to lighten with dawn, her book forgotten, her ears straining for any sound out of place. When her alarm went off at 6:30, she rose and began her morning routine. She moved quietly through the cabin, checking on each girl. Ashley and Megan, still asleep. Danielle curled into a tight ball. Peter from the softball game had somehow convinced Jennifer to let his younger sister join Cabin 7 for the rest of the summer. And there she was, thumb in her mouth. Emily's bunk was empty. Jennifer's chest tightened. She looked to Rebecca's bunk beside Emily's, also empty. She told herself not to panic. The girls had probably just gone to the bathroom. The latrines were a short walk from the cabin, and sometimes the kids went before anyone else was awake. She walked outside and headed toward the bathrooms, her pace quick. The morning air was already warm, promising another scorching day. Birds sang in the trees, and somewhere a door slammed as another counselor began their day. The bathroom was empty. Jennifer's panic bloomed into something larger. She jogged back to cabin 7 and checked the bunks again, as if the twins might have magically reappeared. They hadn't. She woke the other girls and asked if anyone had seen Emily or Rebecca. They rubbed their eyes and shook their heads, confused. Jennifer ran to the main lodge and pounded on Thomas Brennan's door. He emerged in his robe, his gray hair standing up in tufts, his face creased with sleep. "The Hartwell twins," Jennifer gasped. "They're gone." Within minutes, the entire camp was awake. Counselors fanned out across the grounds, calling the girls' names. They checked every cabin, the mess hall, the boathouse, the supply sheds. They searched the woods along the marked trails, their voices echoing through the trees. By 8 o'clock, when the twins had still not been found, Thomas Brennan made the call he had been dreading. He picked up the phone in his office and dialed the Vilas County Sheriff's Department. Emily and Rebecca Hartwell had vanished without a trace. The Vilas County Sheriff's Department dispatched 2 deputies within 20 minutes of Thomas Brennan's call. They arrived at Camp Stillwater just before 9 o'clock on the morning of July 5th, their cruiser kicking up dust as it rolled down the narrow access road. Deputy Frank Kowalski was a veteran officer in his early 40s, a man who had worked every kind of case the Northwoods could produce: bar fights, domestic disputes, hunting accidents, the occasional drowning. His partner, Deputy Lynn Garrison, was younger and newer to the force, but she had sharp eyes and a methodical mind. They found the camp in barely controlled chaos. Counselors were still searching the perimeter, calling the twins' names, until their voices went hoarse. Campers had been confined to the mess hall, where Dorothy Brennan attempted to keep them calm with games and activities, but fear moved through the children like a virus. Some of the younger ones were crying. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process what had happened. Thomas Brennan met the deputies in front of the main lodge, his face drawn and pale. He had aged a decade overnight. He explained the situation as clearly as he could. Jennifer Walsh had discovered the girls missing during her morning check at 6:30. No one had seen or heard them leave. Their belongings were still in their cabin, their duffel bags, their sleeping bags, even their shoes. "Their shoes?" Kowalski repeated, his eyebrows rising. Brennan nodded. "Everything. It's like they walked out in their pajamas and just disappeared." Garrison pulled out a notepad and began taking detailed notes. She asked about the girls' behavior in the days leading up to their disappearance. Had they seemed upset? Had they mentioned wanting to leave camp? Had they had any conflicts with other campers or staff? Brennan shook his head to all of it. The twins had been model campers, he said. Well-behaved, friendly, engaged in activities. The only incident had been Rebecca's unauthorized trip to the ranger station on the night of July 3rd, but that had been handled with appropriate discipline. There had been no indication that either girl was unhappy or planning to run away. "What about the ranger station?" Kowalski asked, latching onto the detail. "Where is it?" Brennan gave them directions, and the deputies exchanged a glance. They would need to check it, obviously. But first they needed to establish a proper search protocol and contact the girls' parents. The call to Michael and Patricia Hartwell was brief and devastating. Patricia answered the phone, expecting perhaps a call about a minor injury or a request to send more spending money. Instead, she heard Thomas Brennan's shaking voice telling her that her daughters were missing, that the police were involved, that they should come to the camp immediately. Patricia's legs gave out. She collapsed onto the kitchen floor, the phone cord stretching taut. Michael took the receiver from her hand and demanded details, his accountant's mind desperately trying to make the numbers add up in a way that made sense. But there was no sense to be found. His daughters had been safe in their cabin at lights out. By dawn, they were gone. The Hartwells threw clothes into an overnight bag and raced north. Michael's hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, Patricia silent and rigid in the passenger seat. The 3-hour drive felt endless. Patricia kept replaying her last conversation with the girls, the way she had knelt and hugged them goodbye. She had told them they could call if they needed anything. But they hadn't called, they hadn't needed anything. Until they had needed everything, and it was too late. By the time the Hartwells arrived at Camp Stillwater, the investigation had expanded dramatically. Sheriff Raymond Decker had mobilized every available officer in the county. State police had been contacted. A command post had been established in the camp's main lodge, with maps spread across tables and radio equipment crackling with updates. Volunteers from the nearby town of Eagle River were arriving in trucks and vans, ready to form search parties. Patricia stumbled out of the car and immediately demanded to see her daughter's cabin. Deputy Garrison led her there, Michael following close behind. The cabin looked exactly as it should. Wooden bunks, scattered stuffed animals, a poster of Michael J. Fox, torn from a magazine, and taped to the wall. Emily's bunk was neatly made. Rebecca's was rumpled, but not unusual. Their suitcases sat at the foot of their beds, still half-packed with clothes that smelled like home. Patricia touched Rebecca's sleeping bag, then Emily's, as if she could summon them back through sheer force of will. Michael stood in the doorway, unable to enter, his mind unable to accept the reality before him. "Where are their shoes?" Patricia whispered. Jennifer Walsh, who had been hovering nearby with red-rimmed eyes, pointed to a wooden cubby near the door. 2 pairs of sneakers sat side by side, laces still tied. Patricia made a sound that was not quite human, a low, keening wail that came from somewhere deep in her chest. Michael moved to her and pulled her into his arms, and they stood there in the cabin that still smelled like their daughters, holding each other as the world collapsed around them. Outside, the search intensified. Deputy Kowalski led a team to the ranger station, following the same overgrown path that Rebecca and her friends had taken 2 nights earlier. The fire tower loomed above them, its wooden beams weathered and gray. The cabin at its base looked even more decrepit in daylight, the roof sagging, the walls streaked with water damage and mildew. Kowalski approached carefully, his hand resting on his service weapon out of habit rather than necessity. He pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The interior was just as Rebecca had described it. A small table, an overturned chair, spider webs, rot, but there was something else now, something the girls wouldn't have noticed in the dark. Scratches on the floor. Long, deep gouges in the wood, as if something heavy had been dragged across it repeatedly. The marks led from the table to a corner of the room, where a section of floorboards looked newer than the rest, less weathered. "Lynn," Kowalski called out, and Garrison appeared in the doorway. He pointed to the floor. "You see this?" She crouched and examined the scratches, then the newer boards. "Someone replaced part of the floor. Recently, maybe. We need to look under there." It took them 20 minutes to pry up the boards. Beneath, they found a crawl space perhaps 3 feet deep. The earth was dark and damp, and the smell that rose from it was thick and organic, decomposition, but old, long settled. Kowalski climbed down with a flashlight. The crawl space extended beneath the entire cabin, supported by fieldstone foundations. He swept his beam across the dirt floor, looking for any sign that the twins had been here. What he found instead were bones. Not human, at least. He didn't think so. Too small, too fragmented. Animal bones scattered across the dirt. Some looked ancient, others more recent. And there was something else. Symbols carved into the wooden support beams. Crude marks that might have been letters or might have been nothing at all, scratched into the wood by someone with a knife or a sharp stone. "Frank?" Garrison called down. "Find anything?" "Maybe, I don't know." He climbed back up, his uniform filthy with cobwebs and dust. "There's something wrong with this place. I can't explain it, but something feels off." They documented everything, took photographs with the department's Polaroid camera, then sealed the cabin as a potential crime scene. but neither of them believed the twins were in there. If they had been, someone would have found evidence, footprints in the dust, disturbed spider webs, something. The search parties combed through the woods in grid patterns, calling the girls names until their throats were raw. They checked every trail, every clearing, every possible place 2 12-year-old girls might hide or might have fallen. Divers were brought in to search the lake, dragging its murky bottom with hooks and nets. Helicopters from the state police flew overhead, their spotlights cutting through the canopy at night, searching for any sign of movement. Days passed with no discoveries. The media descended on the story like carrion birds. Reporters from Milwaukee and Madison set up camp outside the entrance to Camp Stillwater, their satellite vans and cameras turning the quiet logging road into a circus. The story had everything that captured the public imagination: innocent children, a remote location, a complete absence of clues. Nancy Grace, then a prosecutor in Atlanta, would later cite the Hartwell case as one that haunted her during the early years of her career. The investigation expanded beyond the immediate area. Police looked into every registered sex offender within 100 miles. They interviewed drifters and transients who might have been in the area. They questioned the camp staff extensively, looking for any hint of inappropriate behavior or suspicious activity. Thomas Brennan's finances were examined. Jennifer Walsh submitted to a polygraph test, which she passed. Every counselor, every maintenance worker, every person who had been at Camp Stillwater on the night of July 4th was investigated and cleared. The FBI sent agents from their Milwaukee field office. They brought expertise in child abduction cases and access to national databases. They interviewed the Hartwells extensively, not because they were suspects, but because often the key to these cases lay in understanding the victims. What were Emily and Rebecca like? What were their habits, their fears, their dreams? Would they have left willingly with someone they knew, with someone they didn't? Patricia described her daughters in exhaustive detail, as if by remembering every small thing about them she could somehow bring them back. Emily loved to read, especially mysteries and ghost stories. Rebecca was more physical, always climbing trees and racing her bike down steep hills. They fought sometimes, the way siblings do, but they were also inseparable. They had their own twin language when they were younger, a private vocabulary that only they understood. Michael focused on practical matters because it was the only way he could function. He organized volunteer searches. He had missing person posters printed 5,000 copies, each bearing school photographs of his daughters and a phone number to call with information. He drove to every town within a 200-mile radius and tacked the posters to telephone poles, bulletin boards, store windows. His hands bled from stapling so many sheets of paper, but he didn't stop. The summer wore on. Camp Stillwater closed for the season. Its remaining campers sent home early to confused and frightened parents. The property stood empty and silent, yellow police tape fluttering in the breeze. Local teenagers, thrilled by the dark glamour of tragedy, began sneaking onto the grounds at night, daring each other to sleep in the cabin where the twins had vanished. Sheriff Decker had to post a deputy there on weekends to keep trespassers away. By August, the active search had been scaled back. There were simply no more places to look. The FBI agents returned to Milwaukee, leaving behind only the promise that the case would remain open. Sheriff Decker continued to follow up on tips, but most were dead ends. Supposed sightings of the twins that turned out to be other blonde girls, psychics claiming to have visions, conspiracy theorists spinning elaborate tales of satanic cults or government experiments. Patricia Hartwell stopped eating. She lost 20 pounds in a month, her clothes hanging off her frame like a scarecrow's garments. She spent her days in the twins' bedroom, sitting on Emily's bed or Rebecca's, holding their pillows and breathing in their fading scent. Michael tried to pull her back from the edge, but he was falling too, tumbling into a darkness that had no bottom. In September, when Emily and Rebecca should have been starting 7th grade, the Hartwells held a press conference. They stood before cameras and microphones, clutching each other for support, and begged whoever had taken their daughters to let them go. Patricia's voice broke as she spoke directly to Emily and Rebecca, wherever they might be. "We love you. We're looking for you. We will never stop looking for you." But autumn came anyway, indifferent to human suffering. The leaves turned gold and red and fell from the trees. The temperature dropped. The first frost arrived, coating the ground in a layer of crystalline white. The Hartwells bought 2 cemetery plots. Though they had no bodies to bury, they couldn't bear the thought of a funeral, but they also couldn't bear the thought of dying themselves and leaving no place for their daughters to find them. Years passed. 5 years. 10. 15. The case grew cold in the official sense, though it never grew cold for Patricia and Michael Hartwell. They aged rapidly, consumed by grief and the corrosive acid of not knowing. Michael developed a heart condition. Patricia's hair turned completely white by the time she was 50. They divorced in 1995, unable to survive the weight of their shared loss, then remarried 2 years later, because being apart was even worse than being together. The 20th anniversary of the twins' disappearance came and went. A local newspaper ran a retrospective article, but most people had forgotten by then. New tragedies had eclipsed the old one. Camp Stillwater never reopened. Thomas Brennan died in 1998, his last words reportedly being an apology to the Hartwell family. The property was sold at auction, and eventually purchased by a developer who planned to build luxury cabins for tourists. But the construction crew refused to work there after a series of strange incidents. Tools going missing, equipment malfunctioning, one worker claiming to have seen 2 blonde girls standing at the edge of the woods at dusk. The developer abandoned the project. Jennifer Walsh became a therapist specializing in trauma. She never married, never had children of her own. In interviews years later, she would say that she thought about Emily and Rebecca every single day, that she saw their faces in every child she passed on the street. Deputy Frank Kowalski retired in 2005. He kept the Hartwell case file in a box in his basement, unable to let it go even in retirement. He would take it out sometimes late at night and go through the evidence again, searching for something he had missed. The photographs from the ranger station bothered him most. Those symbols carved into the support beams, the animal bones scattered in the crawl space. He had sent the images to experts at the state university, anthropologists and folklorists, but no one could identify what the symbols meant. They might have been Nordic runes, one professor suggested, or Celtic, or nothing at all, just random scratches. The summer of 2017 marked 30 years since the twins' disappearance. Patricia Hartwell was 71 years old. Michael was 73. They still lived in the same house they had occupied when their daughters were born, unable to move away because what if Emily and Rebecca came home and couldn't find them? On July 4, 2017, exactly 3 decades after the twins had vanished, a package arrived at the Vilas County Sheriff's Department. It was addressed to current Sheriff Ray Hartwell Case. There was no return address. The postmark was smudged and illegible. The current sheriff, a woman named Margaret Ellis, who had been a rookie deputy in 1987, opened the package carefully. Inside was a VHS tape, unmarked and in a plain black case. There was also a note, typed on what appeared to be an old typewriter: "You didn't look hard enough." She knew where they were the whole time. Sheriff Ellis felt ice water flood her veins. She had been young during the original investigation, relegated to administrative tasks, while the senior officers handled the fieldwork. But she remembered the case vividly, the fear that had gripped the community, the devastation of the Hartwell family, the awful sense that something evil had touched their quiet corner of Wisconsin and left no fingerprints. She called in her lead detective, a man named Thompson, who had transferred from Green Bay 5 years earlier. Together they watched the tape on the old VCR that the department kept for reviewing evidence. The footage was shaky and dark, clearly shot on an old camcorder. It showed the interior of a room, wood-paneled walls, A single window with faded curtains, a narrow bed in the corner. The camera panned slowly, as if whoever was filming wanted to capture every detail. Then the lens focused on the wall above the bed. Tacked there was a map, a hand-drawn map, sketched on what looked like yellowed paper. The image was grainy, but Ellis and Thompson could make out certain features. A lake, a cluster of cabins, trails through wooded areas, and in one corner marked with a red X was a structure that could only be the ranger station. But there was another X on the map, in a location that didn't correspond to any known building or landmark. It was north of the ranger station, deeper in the woods, in an area that the 1987 search parties had covered, but found nothing. The camera zoomed in on this second X, holding steady for several long seconds. Then the footage cut to black. Ellis and Thompson sat in stunned silence. Finally, Thompson spoke. "Where did this tape come from?" "I don't know, but we need to find out whose room this is, or was." They enhanced the footage as much as their limited technology allowed. One detail emerged that they had missed on first viewing. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, was a jacket hanging on a hook. On the jacket's breast was an embroidered patch, the logo of Camp Stillwater. This had been a counselor's room, or possibly Thomas Brennan's office, somewhere on the camp property. But whose? And more importantly, whose handwriting was on that map? Ellis made the decision to organize a new search of the area, indicated by the second X. It would be a small operation. The department's budget was tight, and there was no guarantee the tape was legitimate. It could be a cruel hoax, someone's idea of sick entertainment, but it could also be real. After 30 years, they owed it to the Hartwell family to follow every lead, no matter how unlikely. On July 15, 2017, a team of 6 officers entered the woods north of the old Camp Stillwater property. They brought ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and a grim sense of purpose. The area they were searching was densely forested, the ground thick with underbrush and fallen logs. In 1987, search parties had walked through here calling for the twins, but they hadn't dug. They had been looking for lost girls, not buried ones. The dogs hit on a spot roughly 3/4 of a mile north of the ranger station. It was a small depression in the earth, barely noticeable beneath decades of leaf litter. The radar showed an anomaly beneath the surface, something that didn't belong. They began to dig. 18 inches down they found fabric, decomposed and faded, but unmistakably clothing, small, child-sized. A pajama top with yellow flowers, the kind a girl might wear to bed on a hot summer night. They called in the state crime lab. The excavation continued with painstaking care, brushes and screens replacing shovels. As the sun set and portable lights were erected, the full scope of the discovery became clear. 2 bodies, small, skeletal, positioned side by side as if sleeping. The bones were examined briefly on site by the forensic anthropologist, female, pre-adolescent, approximately 12 years old. Cause of death undetermined pending full analysis, but there were no obvious signs of trauma to the skeletal remains. Sheriff Ellis made the call to the Hartwell home herself. Patricia answered on the 3rd ring, her voice thin and wary. She had learned long ago not to hope. "Mrs. Hartwell," Ellis said gently, "we found them. I'm so sorry, but we found them." The sound that came through the phone was beyond grief. It was the sound of 3 decades of anguish finding release, of a mother who had spent half her life trapped in the purgatory of not knowing, finally receiving an answer, even if the answer was the one she had always feared. The bodies were identified through dental records as Emily and Rebecca Hartwell. They had been dead since the night they disappeared. The forensic analysis suggested they had died within hours of leaving their cabin, their bodies buried almost immediately. Toxicology tests revealed traces of a sedative drug in the bone marrow, something that would have rendered them unconscious quickly and killed them within minutes in a sufficient dose. But the question remained, who had done this, and how had they known about that map? The investigation reopened with renewed intensity. The VHS tape was analyzed extensively. The typewriter that had produced the note was identified as a 1970s-era Smith Corona, a model common enough to be untraceable. The tape itself was a standard Maxell product, available at any electronics store. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no identifying marks. But there was the map, and there was the room where it had been filmed. Ellis and Thompson returned to the abandoned Camp Stillwater property with the tape. They walked through the decaying buildings, comparing the footage to the physical spaces. The main lodge? No, the walls were wrong. The counselor's barracks? Closer, but still not quite right. Finally, they found it. A small room at the back of the camp office. A space that had been used for storage. The wood paneling matched. The window was in the right place. Even the faded curtains were still there, though they were falling to pieces now. On the wall where the map had hung there was nothing but bare wood, and the faint outlines of where thumbtacks had once been. But when Ellis examined the wall closely, she found something else. Initials carved into the paneling, so small they were easy to miss. D. Dorothy Kemper, Brennan. Thomas Brennan's wife, who had run the camp alongside him, who had access to every building, every room, who had been there the night the twins disappeared, who had died in 2003 of a stroke, taking her secrets with her. Ellis pulled Dorothy's file from the archives. There was little there. She had been interviewed in 1987, of course, but perfunctorily, she was the camp director's wife, a grandmother figure, 62 years old at the time. No one had suspected her of anything. But as Ellis dug deeper, patterns began to emerge. Dorothy Brennan had been born Dorothy Kemper. Her younger brother was David Kemper, the 16-year-old counselor who had drowned in the lake in 1969. The drowning that some people had whispered was not an accident at all. Ellis found an old interview with one of David's friends, conducted by a local reporter in 1970. The friend claimed David had been upset in the days before his death, that he had discovered something disturbing about his sister. He wouldn't say what, but he had been planning to report it to the police. He had drowned before he could. The investigation took on a new, darker shape. Ellis obtained a warrant to exhume Dorothy Brennan's body. The autopsy revealed something that had been missed in 2003. Evidence of long-term use of sedative medications, the same class of drugs that had killed the twins. Dorothy had suffered from insomnia and anxiety. Her medical records showed. She had prescriptions going back decades. But why? Why would a 62-year-old grandmother murder two innocent children? The answer, when it finally emerged, was as chilling as the crime itself. Among Dorothy's possessions, stored in her daughter's attic, investigators found journals. Dozens of them, dating back to the night. The entries were rambling and often incoherent, but certain themes emerged. An obsession with her brother David, with his death, with the idea that he had been taken from her unfairly, and a growing belief, developed over years, that she could somehow bring him back through sacrifice. The entries from July 1987 were explicit. She had chosen Emily and Rebecca because they were twins. Double souls, she called them, twice the power. She had given them drugged hot chocolate before the fireworks, knowing it would take effect hours later. She had waited until the camp was asleep, then entered cabin 7 and carried their unconscious bodies into the woods. They had never woken up. She had buried them at the spot indicated on her map, a location she believed held spiritual significance, the exact point where her brother's body had been found after he washed up on shore in The map had hung in her private room as a kind of trophy, a reminder of what she had done. And years later, knowing she was dying, she had filmed it and mailed it to the sheriff's department. Not out of remorse, the journals made clear, but out of pride. She wanted someone to know. She wanted her work to be recognized. The case closed in December 2017. Sheriff Ellis held a press conference and explained, as much as she could bear to, what had happened. Patricia and Michael Hartwell attended, their faces carved from stone. There was no satisfaction in finally knowing, no sense of closure. Their daughters had been murdered by a woman they had trusted, a woman who had seemed kind and grandmotherly, and the evil had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Emily and Rebecca Hartwell were buried in the spring of 2018, their caskets side by side beneath a granite headstone that bore both their names and a single epitaph, "Together forever." Patricia died 8 months later, her heart simply giving out as if it had been waiting for permission to stop. Michael followed her within the year. Camp Stillwater was demolished in 2019. The land was purchased by a conservation trust and returned to wilderness. No marker indicates what happened there. The forest has reclaimed it as forests do, growing over the scars and secrets. But sometimes, hikers in the area report strange things. The sound of children laughing in the distance, the glimpse of 2 blonde girls running between the trees, and on hot summer nights when the air is thick and still, some say you can smell strawberry shampoo carried on the breeze, a ghost of innocence forever 12 years old, forever lost. The map that Dorothy Brennan drew, the map that finally brought Emily and Rebecca home, was entered into evidence and then sealed. It remains in a vault in the Vilas County Courthouse, a document of unspeakable evil and the twisted logic of a fractured mind. And in the end, that's all the Hartwell twins became. Evidence in a file, names on a headstone, a cautionary tale whispered around campfires, 2 bright lives snuffed out in their sleep, buried in the dark earth, lost for 30 years because no one thought to suspect the smiling grandmother who made hot chocolate on the 4th of July. The revelation of Dorothy Brennan's guilt should have been the end of the story. In most cases, when a killer is identified and the victims are finally laid to rest, the narrative finds its conclusion. The living grieve, the dead are mourned, and time moves forward with the weight of terrible knowledge. But the Hartwell case refused to close cleanly. In the months following the discovery of the twins' bodies and the posthumous identification of Dorothy Brennan as their killer, strange inconsistencies began to surface. Details that didn't quite align, questions that the official narrative couldn't adequately answer. Sheriff Margaret Ellis found herself returning to the evidence again and again, driven by an instinct she couldn't name, but had learned never to ignore. The first anomaly involved the VHS tape itself. In January 2018, Ellis sent it to the FBI's forensic laboratory in Quantico for advanced analysis. The initial examination had focused on identifying the location shown in the footage, but Ellis wanted to know more about the tape's origins. When was it recorded? What kind of camera had been used? Were there any hidden details in the footage that might have been missed? The results came back in March, and they were troubling. The tape had been recorded sometime between 1995 and 1998, based on the degradation patterns of the magnetic medium and the specific manufacturing markers on the cassette itself. But Dorothy Brennan's medical records showed that by 1995, she was already suffering from advanced arthritis in her hands and significant cognitive decline. Her daughter, Margaret Brennan Cole, confirmed that her mother had been largely confined to a wheelchair by 1996 and had required full-time care. The woman who filmed that video had steady hands and clear intentionality. She had mounted a camera on a tripod, carefully framed the shot, zoomed in deliberately on specific details. It didn't match the profile of a woman in her 70s with severe physical limitations. Ellis brought this discrepancy to Detective Thompson, who had been equally uneasy about certain aspects of the case. Together they began to dig deeper into Dorothy Brennan's life, looking beyond the journals that had seemed to provide such a neat explanation. What they discovered was that the journals themselves were problematic. A handwriting analyst, brought in to verify their authenticity, noted subtle inconsistencies in the penmanship across different entries. The journals appeared to be written by the same person, but the pressure of the pen strokes varied in ways that suggested some entries had been written while the author was calm, and others while under significant physical or emotional stress. More damningly, Some of the entries from 1987 referenced events that hadn't been widely reported until years later, specific details about the search process, comments made by investigators that had never been released to the public. Someone added to these journals after the fact, the analyst concluded. Possibly years after. The ink tests on several pages suggest they were written in the late 1990s, not in... Thompson leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his graying hair. So someone wanted us to think Dorothy did this. They planted the journals, made the tape, sent it to us anonymously. But why? Ellis asked. She was already dead. What's the point of framing a dead woman? Maybe, Thompson said slowly, because the real killer is still alive. They returned to the original investigation files from 1987, reviewing every interview, every statement, every piece of evidence with fresh eyes. One name kept appearing in the margins of reports, mentioned briefly but never seriously investigated. Jennifer Walsh, the counselor from Cabin 7. She had been 22 years old in 1987, in her third summer at Camp Stillwater. She had discovered the twins missing, had been the last adult known to have seen them alive. She had passed a polygraph test, but polygraphs, Ellis knew, were famously unreliable. Sociopaths could beat them easily. Ellis tracked down Jennifer Walsh, now Jennifer Walsh Burton, living in Ashland, Wisconsin, where she maintained a small private practice as a trauma therapist. She was 53 years old, never married despite the hyphenated surname, no children. Her life appeared modest and unremarkable on the surface. Ellis and Thompson drove to Ashland on a cold morning in April 2018. They didn't call ahead, didn't give warning. They wanted to see Jennifer's face when they arrived unannounced, wanted to gauge her reaction. The house was a small bungalow on a quiet street, lined with old maples. Jennifer answered the door wearing jeans and a cardigan, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked at the badges they held up, and for just a moment, so brief it might have been imagined, something flickered across her face. Fear, recognition, satisfaction. "Sheriff Ellis," Jennifer said, her voice carefully neutral. "I wondered if you might come. Please come in." The interior of the house was tastefully decorated, but sparse, almost clinical. Books lined the walls, psychology texts, true crime volumes, collections of poetry. A cat wound between Ellis's legs as she entered, purring. They sat in the living room, and Ellis studied Jennifer carefully. She was an attractive woman, aging well, with the kind of calm demeanor that probably served her well as a therapist. But there was something else there too, something watchful in her eyes. "You know why we're here," Ellis said. It wasn't a question. Jennifer nodded slowly. "You have questions about Dorothy, about whether she really did it." "Did she?" Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "I don't know. I've thought about that night every day for 31 years, and I genuinely don't know." Thompson leaned forward. "Tell us about that night. Everything you remember, even details you think might not be important." Jennifer closed her eyes, and when she spoke, it was as if she were reading from a script she had memorized decades ago. "I did the head count at lights out. All 8 girls were in their bunks. I propped the door open because it was so hot. I read for a while Stephen King, I think. I fell asleep around 11:30. I woke up sometime after 3. Something had woken me, but I didn't know what. I checked outside, saw nothing, went back to sleep. When I woke at 6:30 for morning routine, Emily and Rebecca were gone." "What woke you at 3? Ellis asked. "I've never been sure. A sound, maybe, or just a feeling. Like the air pressure had changed." "Did you see Dorothy Brennan that night?" "Not after dinner. She usually stayed in the main lodge after dark. Her knees bothered her." Thompson pulled out a photograph, one of the enhanced images from the VHS tape, showing the map on the wall. "Do you recognize this room?" Jennifer studied it carefully. "It looks like it might be the storage room behind the camp office." Dorothy used it sometimes for inventory, but I was never in there myself. Never, Ellis pressed. In 3 summers you never went into that room? I had no reason to. The counselors used a different supply area. Ellis watched her carefully. Jennifer's hands were folded in her lap, perfectly still. Her breathing was even. She showed no signs of nervousness or deception, but she also showed no signs of anything. No grief, no anger, no curiosity about why they were really there. Jennifer, Ellis said quietly, did you send us that tape? No. Do you know who did? No. Do you know why someone would want to frame Dorothy Brennan? Jennifer's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time, Ellis saw something genuine cross her face. It looked almost like pity. Maybe, Jennifer said, because someone wanted the case to be solved, even if the solution wasn't real. Sometimes people need closure more than they need truth. Thompson stood abruptly. That's a hell of a thing for a therapist to say. Jennifer looked up at him. I work with trauma victims, detective. I've learned that sometimes the story we tell ourselves about what happened is more important than what actually happened. The human mind needs narrative. It needs resolution. Without it, we fracture. Ellis felt a chill run down her spine. You're saying someone made up the story about Dorothy to give the Hartwells closure. I'm saying it's possible. I'm saying that after 30 years, maybe someone decided that an imperfect answer was better than no answer at all. They questioned her for another hour, but learned nothing more. Jennifer answered every question calmly, never contradicted herself, never showed the slightest sign of guilt or knowledge beyond what she had already shared. When they left, Ellis felt more confused than when they had arrived. In the car, Thompson was the first to speak. She's lying. Maybe, Ellis said. Or maybe she's telling the truth and we're seeing shadows where there's only light. But the investigation had momentum now, and Ellis couldn't let it go. She requested Jennifer Walsh's full background check, including sealed juvenile records. What she found made her blood run cold. Jennifer Walsh had been born Jennifer Kemper in 19. She was Dorothy Brennan's niece, the daughter of Dorothy's younger brother, David, the counselor who had drowned in 19. Jennifer had been 4 years old when her father died. She had been raised by her mother in Madison, had taken her mother's maiden name after her parents' marriage, dissolved shortly before David's death. But she had maintained a relationship with her Aunt Dorothy throughout her childhood. In fact, it was Dorothy who had gotten Jennifer the counselor position at Camp Stillwater in 1985, when Jennifer was 20 years old and struggling to pay for college. The connection had never been noted in the 1987 investigation because Jennifer had used her mother's surname and never mentioned her relationship to the Brennans. In the chaos and panic following the twins' disappearance, no one had thought to dig into the background of a young counselor who seemed genuinely devastated by the loss. Ellis called an emergency meeting with Thompson and the county prosecutor. They laid out the new information, trying to understand what it meant. So Jennifer is Dorothy's niece, the prosecutor said. That doesn't make her a murderer. No, Ellis agreed, but it does mean she lied to us, or at least failed to disclose a material relationship. Thompson was staring at the evidence board they had constructed, where photographs and documents were pinned in a web of red string. What if it wasn't Dorothy at all? What if it was Jennifer, and she's been playing us from the beginning? Ellis considered this. The timeline worked. Jennifer would have had access to the cabin, to the girls, to the woods. She would have known about the ranger station, about the significance it held for her aunt, and if she had killed the twins, she would have had 30 years to construct a narrative that pointed away from herself. But the motive was still missing. Why would a 22-year-old college student murder 2 children in her care? The answer came from an unexpected source. In May 2018, Ellis received a call from Margaret Brennan Cole, Dorothy's daughter. Margaret had been going through more of her mother's possessions and had found something disturbing. A series of letters exchanged between Dorothy and Jennifer between 9. Ellis drove to Margaret's home in Rhinelander to collect the letters. Margaret, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and perpetual worry lines, handed over a shoebox filled with yellowed envelopes. "I don't know if these mean anything," Margaret said, "but after you came asking about my mother, I couldn't stop thinking. I knew my mom wasn't well in her final years, but she was sharp as a tack in the 80s. She couldn't have done what those journals said. She loved children. She dedicated her life to that camp." Ellis took the box back to her office and read through the letters chronologically. What emerged was a picture of a relationship that went far beyond aunt and niece. Dorothy and Jennifer had been close, certainly, but there was something else in the correspondence, a shared obsession with David Kemper's death, a belief that it had been murder rather than accident, and a growing conviction that the camp itself was somehow responsible. In a letter dated June 1987, just weeks before the twins disappeared, Jennifer wrote, "You were right, Aunt Dot. I can feel it here. The camp took Daddy from us, and it's still hungry. It needs to be fed or it needs to be destroyed. I think I know which one is easier." Dorothy's response was cautious but not dismissive. "Be careful, Jenny. I know you want answers, but some doors shouldn't be opened. Some things should stay buried. Whatever you're planning, think it through. There are consequences to every action, and they last longer than we do." Ellis felt her hands begin to shake as she read. This was it, the missing piece. Jennifer hadn't killed Emily and Rebecca out of random psychosis or personal vendetta. She had done it as some kind of twisted sacrifice, an echo of her father's death, a way to finally close a wound that had been bleeding for 18 years. But there was still no concrete evidence. The letters suggested dark thoughts, but didn't constitute a confession. Without physical evidence linking Jennifer to the crime, any prosecutor would struggle to build a case. Ellis made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her career. She decided to confront Jennifer one more time, but not as a law enforcement officer, as a person seeking truth. She drove back to Ashland alone, without Thompson, without backup. She arrived at Jennifer's house just after sunset on a warm evening in late May. The same cat met her at the door, purring. Jennifer opened the door and seemed unsurprised to see her. "You found the letters," Jennifer said. "Yes. Would you like to come in? I've made tea." They sat in the living room again, but this time the atmosphere was different. The pretense had been stripped away. They were two women who knew terrible things, sitting across from each other in the gathering dark. "Tell me the truth," Ellis said. "Not for a case, not for a trial. Just tell me what really happened." Jennifer was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant, as if she were narrating events that had happened to someone else. "I was 4 when my father drowned, too young to understand death, but old enough to know he was gone. My mother fell apart. We moved away, changed our name, tried to start over. But Aunt Dorothy kept in touch. She would visit, always in secret, always bringing stories about the camp, about my father. She told me he had been special, gifted, sensitive to things other people couldn't see. She said the camp was built on old ground, sacred ground, and that my father had been chosen by it somehow, that his death wasn't an accident. It was a calling he had answered." Ellis listened without interrupting. "As I got older, I became obsessed with understanding what she meant. I studied everything I could about the land, the history. There were stories from before the camp existed. Native American legends about the area being a thin place where the boundary between life and death was permeable. Settlers in the 1800s reported strange occurrences, disappearances. The ranger station was built in 1923, and 3 different rangers died or went missing while stationed there. When I got the job at the camp in 1985, I thought I would finally understand, and I did feel something there, something in the woods. Something in the water, a presence, a hunger. It was subtle, but it was real. I could feel it growing stronger as the years passed. By the summer of 1987, I knew something was going to happen. I could feel the camp waiting. It needed something, and I thought if I didn't give it what it wanted, it would take something else. Something worse. Ellis felt her skin crawl. So you killed Emily and Rebecca. Jennifer met her eyes. I made a choice. I thought I was protecting the other campers. I thought that if I gave the camp what it wanted, 2 souls, twins, a mirror sacrifice to balance my father's death, it would be satisfied. It would sleep again. That's insane, Ellis whispered. Is it? Jennifer asked. How many disappearances have there been in those woods since the camp closed? None. How many accidents? How many drownings? None. The land is quiet now. It got what it wanted. Ellis stood up, her hands trembling with rage and disgust. You murdered 2 children based on superstition and delusion. You destroyed a family, and then you spent 30 years building an elaborate frame job to pin it on your dead aunt. I didn't frame her, Jennifer said calmly. I documented what she believed, what we both believed. The journals were started by her. Yes, but I finished them. I made the tape to ensure the girls would be found, that Michael and Patricia could finally lay them to rest. I gave them closure. You gave them a lie. I gave them peace. Isn't that worth something? Ellis wanted to arrest her right there, but she knew it was pointless. Everything Jennifer had just said was inadmissible. No Miranda warning, no recording, no witnesses. It was confession without consequence. I'll find a way to prove it, Ellis said. I'll find evidence. I'll build a case and I'll put you away for the rest of your life. Jennifer smiled sadly. Maybe. But even if you do, Sheriff, ask yourself this. What will that accomplish? The Hartwells are dead. The camp is gone. The twins are buried. The only thing a trial would do is reopen wounds that have finally started to heal. Is that really justice? Or is it just revenge? Ellis left without another word. She drove back to the county seat with tears streaming down her face, furious at Jennifer's manipulation, at her own helplessness, at a system that sometimes let monsters slip through its fingers. Over the following months, Ellis and Thompson worked tirelessly to build a case against Jennifer Walsh. They re-examined every piece of evidence, conducted new forensic tests, interviewed anyone who had known Jennifer in 1987, but decades of degradation had taken their toll. The physical evidence was too compromised. The witnesses' memories were too faded, and without a confession on record, without some concrete link between Jennifer and the crime, the prosecutor refused to move forward. We know she did it, the prosecutor said. But knowing isn't the same as proving. A defense attorney would tear this apart in minutes. Ellis was forced to watch as Jennifer Walsh continued her life, continued her practice, continued helping trauma victims process their pain. The irony was so dark, it was almost funny. But Ellis couldn't let it go entirely. She made sure Jennifer knew she was being watched. Regular check-ins, friendly visits, subtle reminders that the case was still open. Jennifer bore it all with the same calm, unsettling grace. In November 2019, Jennifer Walsh closed her practice and moved away from Wisconsin. She left no forwarding address, though Ellis eventually tracked her to a small town in northern Minnesota. The harassment allegations came shortly after. Jennifer claimed that Sheriff Ellis was conducting a campaign of stalking and intimidation based on unproven theories. An internal affairs investigation found no wrongdoing, but Ellis was encouraged to let the matter rest. She retired in 2020, bitter and defeated. The Hartwell case remained officially solved. Dorothy Brennan identified as the killer. Motive established. Case closed. The public accepted this narrative. True crime podcasts and YouTube documentaries told the story of the camp director's wife driven mad by grief, who murdered 2 innocent twins in a delusional attempt to resurrect her dead brother. Only a handful of people knew the truth, that somewhere in northern Minnesota, a woman who had committed the perfect crime lived out her days in peace, convinced she had done the right thing, that her sacrifice had meaning. And perhaps in some dark corner of the universe where logic bends and ancient hungers still prowl, she was right. The old Camp Stillwater property remains undeveloped land, owned by a conservation trust and left to return to wilderness. But local hikers still report strange phenomena, the sound of children's laughter echoing through the trees, glimpses of blonde girls running through the shadows, and on certain nights, a smell like strawberry shampoo carried on the wind. Skeptics dismiss these reports as suggestion and superstition, the mind's tendency to see patterns where none exist. But those who have felt the presence in those woods know better. They know that some places remember the blood that soaked into their soil. Some places are never quite empty, no matter how many years pass. In the end, the Hartwell case asks more questions than it answers. What is justice when the guilty never face consequences? What is truth when the official story serves a purpose but isn't accurate? And what becomes of evil when it wears the mask of healing? When the murderer dedicates her life to helping others process trauma she herself created. Perhaps those are questions without satisfying answers. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some truths too uncomfortable to speak aloud. But on July 4th each year, those who remember light candles for Emily and Rebecca Hartwell, two 12-year-old girls who went to summer camp expecting adventure and found only darkness, who were betrayed by someone they trusted, who were buried in unmarked graves for 30 years, while their killer walked free. They deserved better. They deserved justice. They deserved to grow up, to live full lives, to become more than cautionary tales and true crime content. Instead, they became something else. Evidence that the monsters aren't always who we expect them to be, that evil doesn't always look like evil, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who never leave fingerprints. Only questions that echo through decades, unanswered and unanswerable. The map that Dorothy Brennan drew, or that Jennifer Walsh drew in her aunt's hand, remains sealed in the Vilas County Courthouse vault. Sheriff Margaret Ellis tried to have it destroyed multiple times, arguing that it served no purpose except as a monument to manipulation and murder. But the law requires evidence to be preserved, even evidence that tells lies, and so it remains, a document of deception, waiting in the dark for someone to find it and ask the questions. Ellis asked to follow the threads she followed, to arrive at the same terrible understanding that sometimes we solve the wrong crime, sometimes we punish the wrong person, and sometimes the killer gets away with it. Not because they're clever or lucky, but because the truth is too disturbing for anyone to accept. The Hartwell twins are gone. Their parents are gone. Camp Stillwater is gone. But Jennifer Walsh remains, and in remaining she proves that the most successful murders aren't the ones that go unsolved. They're the ones that get solved incorrectly, where someone else takes the blame, where the narrative is so neat and satisfying that no one questions it too deeply. And late at night, when the wind moves through the northern Wisconsin forests and the lake water laps against forgotten shores, you can almost hear them. Two girls, 12 years old forever, calling out in the darkness for someone to hear them, someone to believe them, someone to tell their story the way it really happened. But no one is listening anymore. The case is closed. The monuments are erected. The truth is buried deeper than any grave. And the woman who put them there sleeps peacefully, convinced of her own righteousness, certain that what she did was necessary, that the sacrifice meant something, that the blood on her hands has long since washed away. Perhaps she's right. Perhaps in some cosmic sense, her actions did serve a purpose, did balance some unknowable equation. Or perhaps she's simply a murderer who got away with it. And all the philosophy and mysticism in the world can't change that fundamental truth. We'll never know for certain. And maybe that's the most terrifying thing of all.